I'm just going to start off by kind of going over the purpose. This is a special called follow-up meeting to the March 13th ICC meeting, where the rate study recommendations were reviewed. At that meeting, Commissioner Boswell, Commissioner Burdeshaw, and Amy asked that programs send them any questions or comments they may have regarding the recommendations. So over the past couple of weeks, we've compiled a list of all the questions and we met to answer them. So we have broken the questions into 6 topics. We will go through each question submitted, and after all the submitted questions are answered, we will ask for any additional questions. Now, keep in mind, there may be some questions we can't answer at this time, but we will definitely get back with everyone with the answers. So having said that, we will get the opening remarks from Commissioner Burdeshaw.
First of all, thank you. It's great to see everyone. I see that we've got about 108 at the moment on the Zoom call. Hopefully we won't crash our Zoom call with this many folks, but I appreciate everyone joining. We're going to do our best to answer all of the questions that were submitted. There are a couple that we won't be able to answer yet because there's still more information that we need to gather and still partners that we've got to get additional answers from. So unknowns, things that we don't know and won't be able to tell you exactly today, that is things like whether or not Medicaid has completely accepted the rate recommendations. We don't have that answer yet. Third-party billing, when will that happen? We don't know that answer. Those are conversations we'll have to have with folks like Blue Cross Blue Shield and others here in the state of Alabama. So we don't have all the answers in those areas, but we'll do our best to answer what we do know. There will be policy questions, policies that need to be developed as we move into new rates and new discussions. We'll need to develop policies together as a group around those topics. We also know that many of you, if you play kind of this scenario out, and as we get to the questions, you'll see what I'm talking about. But we know that there will be a need for, we already knew this, but even more so if we move into this rate structure, will be how will we staff these needs? How will we provide all the services that are needed and in the areas where they're needed to all the children that are coming through early intervention services? These are questions that we continue to have along with you. And we know that one of the things that we would need to do moving forward is develop programs, additional early intervention programs to meet the need. We already knew that we were going to need to do that. We know that even more so now. Before we jump into the questions, Amy and I have talked, the rest of our leadership team, Shay Cannon, our CFO, and others have talked. We felt it might be good just to go back, quickly review what Zane shared with you in our last ICC meeting, just a quick run through of the rate calculations and how those were developed. Specifically, we want to dive into billable factor. What is in billable factor? What does that mean? Because a lot of your questions are around that subject. So we'll quickly have Shay go through the rates, and then we'll answer some questions about that billable factor before we go into all of the FAQ document, all the questions we've gathered, and all of the answers that we have for you today. So Shay, I'm gonna kick it to you. Are you on the call?
I am. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and apologize. My voice is spotty and touch and go. Of course, I woke up with allergy issues this morning because why not, right? Perfect timing. So let me see here if I can. Can everybody see? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and, excuse me, just real quickly before I kind of walk step by step through the rate buildup methodology, I wanted to kind of address this formula right here because at the very simplistic view, this is what it looks like and how PCG built the rate. And keep in mind, as we go through this, this is from varying different sources. The majority of it is from the cost that, the program shared with PCG, along with some Bureau of Labor statistics information as well on some of those that as an example, I think pediatrician, nobody was directly using a pediatrician, but they wanted to account for that. So they pulled some of those numbers from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. If you want to see those at a later time, just go back to slide 8 for those who have the presentation, and it will kind of walk you through each of those sections and some of the documentation that was used to build the rate. But just again, very simplistic. The way that the rate build up happened for PCG is they started with hourly wages that were reported, as well as fringe costs, to come up with personnel costs for providing the direct service. And excuse me, that would be information that would be getting billed, because again, it's for those times. They looked at administrative costs and added that as well. That's going to be things like your overhead, keeping the lights on, keeping the doors open, paying the accountants, payroll, et cetera. That would be part of your administrative costs. And then the non-billable cost, and we'll go into more detail here in a second on the non-billable costs, but generally that's anything that your direct service providers are doing that doesn't rise to the level of a billable event. So we'll talk about some of those. But again, I just real quickly wanted to kind of go over the simple equation before we get into kind of the mammoth table. For those who have the presentation, this is on page 19 where the rate calculation steps are. This is PCG's rate calculation as they calculate it for developmental specialists and discipline-specific therapists. But all of their rates followed their rate recommendations followed this same model. So that's why I kind of wanted to walk through it with everybody. They started with salaries of your direct service providers. And once they received all that based off the cost report, they did a weighted average. And you'll see the $25.25 per hour and the $37.68 per hour. They also took what was reported for fringes that were paid for these providers and came up with the 14.23% fringe rate based off of the fringe that was being paid on these direct service providers. So line 3 is literally just taking line 1 plus line 2, and that's your total direct personnel weighted average of employees of $28.84 for developmental specialist and $43.04 for discipline specific. From there, they looked at independent contractors and the program cost for independent contractors.
Get in the bed with Zoe. Get set up, Zoe. Gotta put something up. You don't have to. I can cover you up.
Hey, excuse me. If you are on this call, please mute your mic, because we can hear your conversations in the background. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. So once they figured out how much it cost the programs for the direct services being provided per hour, they looked at the independent contractor cost as well that were having to be contracted out to provide those services. And you see where that for developmental special was $52.68 and discipline specific was $70.06. So they wanted to account for both the employee costs and the contractor costs, because as everything was reviewed in the time study and the cost report, it appeared that most programs, it was about a half and half split almost. Half were using contractors, half had full-time employees. So we wanted to make sure that we accounted for those costs for whatever model was being used. And so that is where the 59.60% and the 40.40%. Once they looked at it, looked like 59.60% of personnel costs were attributed to full-time employees, staff. And so they took the 59.60% times the employee cost per hour to include fringe of 28.84 to come up with a 17.19. And then they did the same thing with the contractor cost at 40.40%, since those personnel costs were attributed to the contractors. And again, did the same thing to come up with $21.28. And then they took the 17.19, they added it to the 21.28 to get your total of $38.47. So basically, we're taking the average of the contractor cost and the full-time employee cost and looking at it from that lens. And you'll notice the 38.47 actually falls between the 28.84, that's the total salary and fringe for full-time employees, and the $52.68 for the independent contractors to come up with the $38.47 cost per hour for direct personnel time. So that's just for the hour for the PTOT special instructor to go out and provide the services. That is what that cost is accounting for. Next, they took a look at administrative costs, which again would be accounting, HR, personnel, rent payments, etc., utilities. Those are going to be some of your administrative costs. And what they found based off the cost reports was that accounted for 31.20% of total program cost. So briefly, let's see if I can get to it. Some of the admin, personnel, and overhead expenses that were reported are here. You'll see where 14% of it, of that 31.2%, is for the administrative salaries and hourly employees, independent contractor costs, and those are just for independent contractors that are doing administrative functions, not direct services. 17% non-personnel cost. What that includes is things such as consumables and miscellaneous, which you'll see here what makes up the largest group, but also includes administrative allocation, which over half the programs are utilizing office supplies, COVID-related PPE, et cetera. It also includes travel costs. So when folks are traveling to see families, that's where the travel is included. So that being said, that 31.2% is accounted for in line 8, where they're taking that 31.20% administrative costs that were reported, they're multiplying it by the hour of direct services to come up with the cost to provide those administrative costs for that 1 hour of direct services. So as an example, developmental specialists, for every $38.47 spent providing services, programs are incurring $17.45 of administrative costs. So when you take the direct personnel time admin, you get a total of $55.92 for that direct hour of service. Just as I said, mileage was included in the non-personnel costs, part of this 31.20%. So that was taken out, and it'll get put back in. You'll see it in a minute, so don't panic, but it got taken out. And so that $1.85, what they found was 3.31% of the total cost is associated with travel reimbursement. So they took the 3.31%, came up with $1.85. The $1.85 is subtracted from the $55.92 to come up with the $54.07. So this is your total cost per hour less reported mileage. So then we will move on to line 12. And this is where billable factor comes in. And I know that there's a lot of questions about billable factor. So the best way I can explain this is the billable factor is a calculation based off what was reported on the time study to account and mark up for non-billable activities. So just as an example, some of the non-billable activities, a family cancels, you have to do some data entry into gifts. Some of the other stuff that was reported was staff meetings, providing interpretation, interpretation, translation, sorry, I'm reading off a list, no shows with staff, etc. So all of that was included in the time study, and the billable factor is accounting for that and then being used to mark up the hourly rate to show the cost associated with those non-billable activities. So the non-billable activities are the activities that the direct service providers are doing, they just can't be billed for. So what they found is there was a gamut. You had some staff who the billable factor was 17%, some were in the 30%. So there was an average taken of the direct service providers in the calculation at 45%, is where we landed at the 45%. And again, that basically says for every hour, when you do the mathematical calculation, what that 45% says is for every hour of direct services, your direct service provider is spending 2.23 hours on that service. So it's 1 hour of the direct service time and then an additional 1.23 hours on the non-billable activities like traveling or no-shows, etc. So this 45% billable factor is to help account for the costs associated and that are driven by providing that direct hour of service that's just not billable. So once you do the calculation at the 45%, you see where they took the 5407 divided by the 45% to get to $120.16. What that says is for 1 hour of direct service, it cost $120.16 for a developmental specialist. That includes your administrative costs, so your accountants, your HR, all of your overhead. It accounts for the hour of actual direct service, and then the additional 1.23 hours for every hour of direct service that is indirect activities that your direct service providers are having to complete. Once they got there, PCG added the $6.35 back into the mileage, into the rate, which gets you to the total of $126.50 per hour to provide an hour of direct service. So I know it's a lot. I'm just going to pause for a second and see if there's any questions.
Shay, I want to step in too and say, if you do have a question you think about, go ahead and you can put it in the chat. We have someone that will be monitoring the chat. So if there's a question that you don't want to answer on here, then you can put it in the chat. Thanks.
If there's no questions, I will kick it back to the commissioner.
Thank you, Shay. I think it was just a good idea for us to all see that again. And I think we have more people on the call today than we did in our last ICC meeting. So hopefully that will give you a quick overview before we get into the questions. I want to quickly talk about 4 data inputs that actually inflated the rate that PCG asked us as an agency, did we want to leave those in? We chose to leave all of those data inputs and all of those factors in the rate study because we knew that it would benefit the programs. Those 4 items were contractor time. You guys pay contractors more than you pay staff per hour. We felt like if we didn't leave that in, it would unfairly impact the programs. So we left that contractor factor into the rate study. The second was the travel time and mileage being broken apart. Your time being spent going to a house is just as important in that rate as the mileage required to get there. And so we wanted to make sure that that was reflected in the rate. The third was administrative time. That was a big discussion point for us, because in Alabama, what PCG shared with us was that we spend more time on those non-billable activities than most states, actually than any state that they had worked with. Meaning that there's more time spent on that paperwork and those non-billable time per direct service hour than other states. So we had to talk about that and determine how we wanted to manage that. We know that we want to help you long-term by updating the gifts system and streamlining third-party billing through the department and creating some breathing room for you in that area. However, until we get that done, we did not want to reduce that rate in any way to impact the program. So we left the administrative time in at a fairly high rate in comparison to the national average. We also, when you talk about administrative time and service coordination, we know that service coordinators through the time study spend more time on those administrative non-billable hours than on the other discipline specific staff. So we adjusted that billable factor to reflect that additional administrative time for service coordination. So that is also reflected in the rate when you look at the service coordination piece. So with that, I think it's time that we move on to the questions that you had for us. And each of us, like Deborah said, are going to take some topical areas and answer the questions around those topics. And then we'll open the floor up. And I think, Shay, you're up first with rate setting questions.
So just some general rate setting questions that were posed. I'm just going to go through them quickly, and then if there's any additional questions, we'll try to answer them the best we can. The first question I had was, is the state planning to adjust their current vendor rate of $70 and evaluation rate of $60 based on these new recommendations? What will the new vendor rates be? All we know at this time is that EI vendor rates are subject to change, but that is about all the information we have at this time on the vendor rates. Were the rates based on cost averaging of salaries and expenses, meaning that half the programs will benefit from the higher average rate and half will have funding decrease to what will be a lower average rate for them? Again, the rates, just as we had previously discussed, rates were calculated using the weighted average between the contractor, full-time employees, and the Bureau of Labor and Statistic information that was utilized by PCG. So that's where the rates came from. Was there an Alabama Early Intervention System budget ceiling that factored into the rate computations? If programs can demonstrate that the proposed rates are insufficient, is the Alabama Early Intervention System willing to make adjustments to mitigate program losses? So no, the rate computations were based off of the program costs that were reported by the programs and not the revenue available. Fiscal projections show that we will spend the equivalent of current spending before any changes in year one of the changes. And then the last question that I have is, will there be an automatic cost of living adjustment annually, or will programs have to wait for new rate studies every few years before rates are adjusted? And the quick answer to that is no. So any questions? All right.
Shay, I'm sorry. This is Jessica Edmiston. Do you mind going back and repeating, even though this is recorded, the rates were based on the program costs reported. It was the bullet prior to the last bullet, please.
Yes. So the question was a budget ceiling factored into the rate computations? And the answer is no, PCG used cost from the cost reports that programs submitted. And if I remember right, there was 31 out of 34, and AIDB was included as one, even though they have multiple locations. And the time studies, along with the Bureau of Labor and Statistic information. So it was based off cost, and revenue was not part of that computation.
Yes, so to jump in and just, the way I think about it is, you know, what does it actually cost you to provide the service? That's what we want to know. We want to make sure that we cover those costs. Once we answer that question, then we go, okay, what does the fiscal projection look like? Can we afford this? And so it's really two separate issues. One is the rate study, and we want to make sure the rate study is accurate. And then two, what do we need? What funding mechanism will we need to cover those costs? So hopefully that answers your question.
It's Jessica one more time, and I'm so sorry. And part of it is I'm not a Shay, I'm a Jessica. So, but I would think that revenue would have to be part of the equation, because that is how we do cover our costs. So, and I'm sorry, and perhaps we can talk a little bit offline, but I would think that for a lot of the EI programs, revenue would have to be part of the equation, because that's how costs are covered.
Okay, Shay, you want to answer that? But I think, Jessica, when we heard the question, we were looking at revenue for the program, the entire program coming in is how I interpreted the question. Shay, you want to?
Right. And that's how I interpreted it as well. I know that there's concern with our budget and revenue, but to the commissioner's point, that is a separate piece of the puzzle. What was tackled here is what does it cost to provide services, in order to be able to know what down the road the revenue is needed. So, but we needed to know what it really, what the true costs were for the programs, and how can that be addressed in order to be able to provide the services. And once we get that picture, then we can start talking about the revenue piece for us. But to the commissioner's point, I think this question was more about revenue for the programs.
Yes, ma'am, and I do understand that. And last point, this is Jessica again, but for AIDB, at least, any revenue that comes in has to be expended within the same fiscal year as the revenue garnered. So it is a total cost of program. And so I'll leave it there for a minute, but I may have more questions related to that when that piece is discussed.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions before I move to Amy? All right, Amy, I think you're next with some programmatic questions.
This is Cheryl. I messaged you directly, Shay. When you said no, I was just confused because there was two scenarios, what you were saying on the cost of living increases.
So the question was, will there be an automatic cost of living adjustment annually, or will programs have to wait for new rate studies every few years before rates are adjusted? And currently, the answer is no, there will not be an automatic cost of living adjustment to these rates. And at this time, there is not plans in the near future, obviously, for another rate study.
Okay, Shay, this is Dennis Gilliam, AIDB. Before, I know Jessica asked several questions from AIDB. Before we roll on, is this the last aspect of questions that'll be answered regarding financials?
Oh, no. We've got, it's all touching on the rate study, but some of them are very specific. As an example, third-party reimbursements from Medicaid and private insurance, et cetera. So these questions were just specific to rate setting. And then there's some that are specific fiscal questions for programmatic purposes. I believe there's some DMH questions we'll be touching, evaluation rates, and service coordination and special instruction rate. So it's rate study all day long, sir, all day long.
Okay, well, I just want to make sure we didn't miss an opportunity to ask a specific question, and I didn't want to have to revisit and make you go back online when it was someone else's turn. So I appreciate
Oh,
that.
no, that's fine. And for those who think of something afterwards, I think that is for 2 hours, but I'm always available. You can give me a call.